I never thought I'd find her here," Ethan Hayes muttered, his voice barely audible over the whispering wind that rolled through the canyon. The sun was just cresting the jagged horizon, casting streaks of gold across the dry earth, dust motes drifting lazily in the morning light. Ethan guided his weary horse down the uneven path toward the tiny settlement, boots crunching against the loose dirt, eyes scanning the scattered buildings for any sign of life. The town was quiet, almost suspiciously so, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. A faint breeze carried the scent of worn leather, sun-baked timber, and the faint tang of river water from a distant creek. At the edge of the market square, Ethan spotted movement, a small figure hunched against the side of a weathered shed, shoulders hunched, head bowed, wrapped in tattered clothing. Her dark hair fell in messy strands across her face, catching the sunlight in thin, glinting threads. She shifted slightly as he approached, revealing a pair of keen eyes, sharp and alert despite the exhaustion etched into her features. Ethan slowed, keeping his hands visible, reins loose, letting the horse move with a deliberate gentleness that mirrored his own caution. He noticed the subtle signs of hardship, a pair of cracked leather shoes, a faded dress threadbare at the edges, and the careful way she clutched a small satchel to her chest as if it contained everything she owned. For a moment, Ethan felt the weight of the town's judgment before even entering the square, the silent whispers of people who had already deemed her unworthy echoing in his mind. Yet he saw something else beneath her weariness, a quiet strength, a spark of resilience that refused to be snuffed out by circumstance. He drew closer, feeling the heat of the sun against his back and the prick of sweat along his neck, hearing the horses breathing in shallow, steady gusts. "Are you all right?" he called softly, voice steady but low, not expecting a reply. The girl flinched but did not flee, eyes darting toward him, then back to the ground, as if weighing the stranger's intent. Ethan dismounted, boots striking the hard-packed soil, and held out a hand not just as an offer of assistance but as a signal that he came without malice. The horse shifted, ears flicking, nostrils flaring at the faint sense of wind and earth, yet remained calm under Ethan's careful guidance. He could see now the details he hadn't noticed at first, a silver chain peeking from under the folds of her dress, worn smooth in certain spots, dangling an amulet that caught the sunlight and sent tiny sparks across the dirt. It seemed to hum with a significance that he couldn't yet place, a token from a past she carried silently. The air between them was charged, a quiet tension balanced by the rhythm of the town waking around them, doors opening and closing with the slow creak of hinges, the faint murmur of early risers beginning their day. Ethan took a slow step closer, voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to be here alone." The girl's eyes met his, dark and wide, reflecting a mixture of caution and something deeper, a history unspoken, a story waiting for acknowledgement. Dust swirled in lazy eddies around them, the canyon walls catching the first glimmers of sunlight, and for a single heartbeat, the world seemed to hold still, watching them. Ethan reached gently for the satchel she clutched, not to take but to show his intent, his own breath steady, the horse shifting beneath him, ears pricked toward the soft crackle of movement in the square. And then, as if the desert itself had chosen the moment, a distant bird called, a single note cutting through the silence, and Ethan realized that this encounter, this girl no one wanted, was about to change the course of more than just a morning in a forgotten town. The morning sun climbed higher over the jagged canyon walls, turning the dusty street into a corridor of gold and shadow as Ethan led his horse toward the stable behind the small general store. The town was beginning to stir, the distant clang of a blacksmith hammering metal echoing across the square, mingling with the low murmur of merchants arranging their wares. Isla followed carefully, her steps hesitant but measured, the tattered hem of her dress brushing the dry dirt. Her eyes shifted constantly, absorbing every detail, the way the sunlight gleamed off the edges of wooden beams, the glint of metal on the signs, the faint shimmer of heat rising from the sun-baked earth. Ethan guided her to the edge of the stable, motioning toward the hayloft and a small trough of fresh water for the horse. He spoke softly, voice calm and deliberate. "You can rest here for a moment. The horse needs water and you will too." Isla hesitated, glancing at the horse, then at him, uncertainty and caution reflected in her dark eyes. Dust swirled around their boots as Ethan moved deliberately, reaching into the saddlebag to produce a small cloth bundle wrapped with care, handing it to her. She took it with trembling hands, unraveling it slowly to reveal a loaf of bread, simple and warm, the aroma of baked wheat filling the immediate air. Her lips parted in a silent whisper of gratitude, though no words came, and for a moment, the canyon seemed to still itself around them, as if acknowledging the quiet gesture. Ethan watched her, noting the way her fingers lingered on the bread, the faint scar across her wrist, the silver chain glinting from beneath her dress, catching the sunlight in tiny bursts of brightness. He felt the weight of responsibility, the delicate balance between offering help and respecting her autonomy. A soft breeze picked up from the canyon mouth, carrying the scent of sage and distant pine, stirring the loose strands of hair across Isla's forehead. She blinked against the wind, then slowly sat on a nearby crate, placing the cloth bundle in her lap and carefully tearing pieces of the bread. Ethan leaned against the post of the stable, horse shifting beneath him, ears flicking toward the faint sounds of the town waking. He observed her closely, noting the careful, deliberate movements, the quiet dignity in her posture despite the hardships she had endured. There was a story in her eyes, a silent chronicle of survival and resilience, and Ethan realized that every moment of stillness between them carried meaning beyond the simple act of giving and receiving. He offered a gentle nod, a silent acknowledgement that the canyon and the town, the dust and the sunlight, bore witness to this fragile truce, this moment of understanding. The horse dipped its head to drink, the water rippling in slow circles, reflecting the harsh light and soft glimmers. Isla's gaze followed the motion, and a faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips, not of relief alone, but of recognition that someone had seen her, really seen her, and had chosen to act not out of obligation but out of quiet, steadfast humanity. The wind shifted again, carrying the faint call of a distant hawk across the canyon walls, and for a heartbeat, the town, the horse, the canyon, and the two figures standing there seemed to exist in perfect balance, a moment suspended before the unfolding of events yet to come. The wind shifted again, carrying with it the faint scent of dry earth and sagebrush that clung to the canyon walls, rustling the loose strands of Isla's hair as she adjusted the satchel on her lap. Ethan moved quietly, careful not to startle her, his boots leaving shallow impressions in the sun-warmed dirt as he circled the stable to inspect the horse and its supplies. He noted the careful way she tore the bread into small pieces, as though rationing not just the food but the trust she was extending in this fragile moment. Her eyes, dark and reflective, followed each of his movements, the way he brushed a loose strand of mane from the horse's neck, the way he checked the water trough to ensure it was clean and plentiful. Dust swirled around their feet, catching the light and lazy, glittering motes, and the distant clang of metal from the blacksmith melded with the faint creak of the wind through the wooden buildings, creating a soundtrack of the waking town. Ethan spoke softly, words deliberate. "If you need to sit for a while, it is all right. We are not in a hurry." Isla glanced up, the faintest trace of acknowledgement passing over her features, then looked back at the bread in her hands, her fingers lingering over the simple offering as though measuring the depth of his intent. The horse shifted its weight, soft snorts punctuating the stillness, ears flicking toward the sounds of life slowly emerging from the town, yet remaining calm under the quiet authority of Ethan's presence. He knelt briefly, adjusting the saddlebag straps and checking the contents, making certain that nothing essential had been overlooked, all the while aware of Isla's watchful gaze. Her movements were subtle, deliberate, a mixture of curiosity and restraint, the way her hands rested on her knees, the way her eyes traced the lines of his boots and the folds of his worn shirt, the way she seemed to measure the weight of the moment as carefully as the bread in her lap. A distant hawk called, its sharp notes slicing through the canyon air, and for a heartbeat the world seemed to pause, the horse, the canyon walls, the warm morning sun, and the two figures suspended in a quiet understanding. Ethan reached slowly, deliberately, toward the water trough, dipping a hand to test the temperature, and offered the cool touch to her, a silent gesture of trust and shared space. Isla hesitated, then allowed her fingers to brush against the water, her eyes meeting his with a flicker of recognition, a silent acknowledgement that the gestures, small as they were, carried weight beyond the immediate. The canyon walls reflected the sunlight in long, shifting shadows, dust rising in lazy spirals around their feet, and the town continued its slow awakening, unaware of the subtle connection forming in the stillness of the morning. Ethan straightened, letting the reins of the horse rest loosely against its neck, and Isla rose, the satchel cradled in her arms, the faint glint of the amulet catching the light and reflecting a tiny burst of brightness onto the warm dirt. She stepped carefully toward him, testing the ground, every movement measured yet natural, as though learning the rhythm of this new environment and the man who had entered it with steady hands and quiet intent. The canyon seemed to embrace the moment, wind shifting, sunlight warming, dust floating, and in that silent communion, both Ethan and Isla sensed that the first steps toward understanding had been taken, small gestures building a bridge across the unknown, a promise held not in words but in the deliberate care of actions, the quiet respect that neither had yet spoken aloud, but both felt resonating in the still air around them. The sun had risen fully above the canyon walls, warming the dry dirt with a harsh yet comforting light as Ethan led the horse slowly down the narrow trail toward the outer edge of town. Isla followed, her steps quiet but deliberate, each movement revealing a growing confidence in the man who had chosen to stand beside her. The faint sound of a wind chime tinkling from the general store mingled with the low murmur of early morning activity, merchants arranging wares, the occasional clatter of a tin cup striking a wooden counter, and the subtle creak of weathered boards underfoot. Ethan paused at a small clearing, letting the horse nibble at the sparse grass while he adjusted the straps of the saddlebag, his eyes catching the faint glimmer of the silver amulet at Isla's collarbone. She noticed his gaze and lifted the pendant slightly, as though weighing the unspoken questions it carried, the sunlight reflecting off the smooth turquoise surface in tiny flickers of light across the ground. Dust rose lazily with each step as they began to move again, the town slowly coming alive around them, the distant bark of a dog and the soft coo of a pigeon adding to the layered soundtrack of the canyon morning. Ethan spoke in measured tones, voice low but deliberate. "There is a place not far from here where you can rest safely for a while, away from the eyes that do not understand." Isla nodded, her dark eyes glancing at the buildings ahead, then back to him, and a silent understanding passed between them. The trail wound upward, the dry wind stirring loose leaves and whispering through the cracks of sun-bleached wooden fences, carrying with it the faint scent of distant pine and the earthy aroma of the canyon floor. Every so often, Isla would pause, adjusting the satchel she held, her fingers brushing over the folds of fabric as though seeking reassurance in its weight, a tangible reminder of the journey she had endured. Ethan watched quietly, noting the precise way she moved, the care with which she navigated the uneven stones, the small, careful steps that spoke of resilience honed over time. The horse shifted beneath him, ears flicking toward subtle sounds, a creak of a gate, a soft shuffle of boots, the distant laugh of children, yet remained calm, attuned to Ethan's own steady presence. The canyon walls, tall and jagged, cast shifting shadows that stretched and contracted with the rising sun, and the light painted both their faces in sharp contrasts of brightness and shade. In the stillness between steps, a faint bird call echoed, sharp and clear, cutting through the warmth of the morning air, and for a brief moment, the canyon seemed to pause, holding its breath as though acknowledging the delicate balance of trust forming between man and girl. Ethan extended a hand toward a small stream that crossed the trail, letting the cool water ripple over his palm before Isla bent to touch it herself, the surface breaking with gentle waves, reflecting the golden light in soft patterns. She allowed herself a small, deliberate smile, the first she had shown since he had found her, and Ethan felt the quiet weight of that gesture, a confirmation of the bond beginning to take shape in the silent spaces of shared understanding, the canyon, the horse, and the town around them all holding witness to a moment of patience, care, and trust, fragile yet undeniable in its presence. The path ahead twisted through the canyon, stones scattered unevenly across the dry ground, each step sending tiny puffs of dust spiraling into the golden morning light as Ethan guided the horse slowly, his eyes scanning the distant horizon for signs of change in the terrain or the town beyond. Isla followed at a measured pace, the satchel held carefully against her chest, fingers brushing the folds of her dress as she adjusted to the rhythm of the trail. The air carried the faint scent of sage and the warmth of the rising sun, mixing with the earthy aroma of the canyon floor and the distant hints of wood smoke from early morning fires. Ethan spoke softly, voice steady and low. "There is a place just beyond the ridge where the earth is soft, and the water runs clear. You will find shelter there for as long as you need." Isla glanced toward the ridge, dark eyes reflecting the light and shadows, then back at him, her expression unreadable yet open to the subtle offer of protection. The horse shifted beneath Ethan, ears flicking toward the faint murmur of the town waking, the scrape of boots across weathered wood, and the occasional rattle of a tin cup, yet remaining calm, trusting in the rhythm of Ethan's presence. Dust swirled around their boots as they moved, sunlight catching on small fragments of stone and broken twigs, glinting like tiny sparks in the quiet canyon air. Ethan paused at a shallow stream, letting the horse drink and testing the water with his hand, the coolness sending ripples across the surface that reflected the sky in fragmented patterns. Isla knelt beside him, the water lapping gently against her fingers, eyes fixed on the small waves as though tracing invisible lines of meaning within them, the amulet at her collarbone glinting softly in the sun. The canyon seemed to hold its breath around them, the wind shifting through the sparse brush, rustling dry leaves and stirring the faint scent of distant pine. Ethan adjusted the straps on the saddlebag once more, checking the contents carefully, the quiet precision of his movements mirrored by Isla's careful handling of her satchel. A bird called from high above the canyon walls, a sharp note that echoed across the rocks, and for a single heartbeat the world seemed suspended, the horse, the canyon, the town beyond, and the two figures paused in a delicate moment of shared understanding. Ethan spoke again, voice calm and deliberate. "Rest here for a moment. There is no rush, only the space to catch your breath and see the light as it touches the canyon floor." Isla allowed herself a faint nod, her gaze lifting to meet his, a silent acknowledgement passing between them that the morning, the dust, the wind, and the warmth of the sun were witnesses to a fragile trust forming in the quiet space between gesture and word. The horse shifted its weight, snorting softly, and Ethan reached to smooth a loose strand of mane, the faint movement gentle, measured, and careful, ensuring no sudden motion would disturb the delicate balance of the moment. Isla rose slowly, the satchel resting lightly against her side, and together they moved along the narrow trail, dust rising in small clouds with each step, sunlight catching in the canyon in shifting patterns of gold and shadow, and in the silence between their movements, a quiet understanding settled over them, the start of a journey built on care, patience, and the unspoken promise that each would protect the other as they moved forward through the canyon, the town, and the world beyond. The trail opened into a wider clearing, sunlight spilling across the rocky ground in broad, warm patches as Ethan guided the horse slowly through the scattered stones, the faint crunch of gravel under hoof echoing softly in the canyon air. Isla walked beside him, adjusting the satchel across her shoulder, her dark eyes scanning the edges of the canyon as though memorizing every curve and shadow, every glint of light on the distant rocks. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of dry earth and distant juniper, rustling the edges of her tattered dress and stirring loose strands of hair across her face. Ethan kept his pace steady, voice low and deliberate. "There is a small spring ahead. The water is fresh, and the shade will offer rest for both of us." She nodded, lips pressed into a thin line, her gaze fixed on the trail ahead, the subtle rise of her chest betraying a quiet anticipation. Dust rose in lazy spirals around their boots as the canyon walls narrowed slightly, sunlight dancing across the uneven surface of the rocks, highlighting cracks and crevices in shifting patterns. Ethan adjusted the reins, ensuring the horse moved with care, ears flicking at the faintest noises of the canyon, the distant chirp of a bird, the rustle of a lizard across sun-warmed stone, the whisper of wind brushing against the canyon walls. Isla moved with a cautious grace, every step deliberate, the weight of the satchel balanced evenly as she followed Ethan, eyes alert to the light, the shadows, the subtle changes in the landscape. The amulet at her collarbone caught the sunlight again, glinting softly, a reminder of history and meaning beyond the present moment. Ethan stopped briefly at a cluster of boulders near the spring, letting the horse graze at the sparse grass, water rippling gently in the shallow pool nearby, sunlight dancing across the surface in fragmented reflections. Isla approached slowly, dipping her hands into the cool water, watching the ripples spread outward, her fingers tracing the gentle currents as though following invisible lines of thought. The canyon seemed to hold its breath around them, the warmth of the morning sun, the rustle of leaves, the distant hum of the town below creating a quiet symphony that spoke of patience and the careful unfolding of events. Ethan spoke softly, voice carrying only enough to be heard across the gentle breeze. "Rest here for a moment. There is time to drink and breathe, to let the day settle around us." Isla allowed herself a subtle nod, eyes lifting briefly to meet his, the silent acknowledgement between them carrying weight in the still canyon air. The horse shifted under Ethan, low snort of breath, ears flicking, standing calmly, a quiet participant in the moment, the sunlight glinting on its coat. Dust and sunlight mingled, swirling around their feet as they moved to find a comfortable spot on the shaded edge of the spring. Isla lowered the satchel gently, reaching into it to pull a small piece of bread, breaking it with careful fingers, the faint aroma of baked wheat mingling with the earthy scents of the canyon. Ethan watched, noting her quiet attentiveness, the way she measured each movement, the careful way her eyes scanned the canyon, her posture steady despite the strain of travel and uncertainty. The sun climbed higher, the shadows shifting slowly across the rocky ground, and in that space, the two figures moved with a rhythm that was unspoken yet perfectly understood, a fragile balance of trust, care, and awareness, the canyon holding the stillness around them as witness to the quiet establishment of a connection, the first step in a journey that promised patience, respect, and understanding under the open sky. The canyon widened into a sunlit plateau, the ground stretching out in golden expanses dotted with hardy scrub and twisted juniper, and Ethan guided the horse carefully, adjusting his pace to match the uneven terrain, while keeping a steady watch on Isla as she navigated the rocky path beside him. The morning heat pressed gently against their backs, carrying the subtle scent of dry soil and distant pine, mingled with the faint, crisp aroma of the stream they had left behind, and the gentle rustle of leaves whispered across the canyon floor as the wind moved in soft, irregular patterns. Ethan spoke quietly, voice calm and deliberate. "We are close to a place where the earth opens to shade and the water gathers calmly, a spot where you can breathe without concern." Isla glanced up at him, the sunlight glinting off the silver chain of her amulet, and offered a small nod, her dark eyes scanning the plateau ahead, noting the gentle rise of rocks and the dappled light that promised temporary shelter. Dust swirled around their boots as they moved, catching the sunlight in brief, golden flashes, and the horse shifted slightly, ears pricked, nose twitching at faint scents carried from far across the plateau. Ethan paused briefly at a cluster of smooth, sun-warmed stones, allowing the horse a moment to graze on sparse tufts of grass, while Isla crouched beside a shallow depression in the earth to test the soil and steady her footing, her fingers brushing over small pebbles and the dry grit, grounding herself in the moment. The wind carried the distant murmur of the town below, a faint chorus of life awakening, and for a moment the plateau seemed suspended between the vastness of the canyon and the life of the town, a quiet threshold where time slowed and the air held the potential for understanding. Ethan observed Isla closely, noting the careful deliberation in her movements, the way her gaze traced the edges of the rocks, the subtle shift of her weight as she adjusted to the terrain, and the slight glimmer of the amulet catching sunlight with each movement. He spoke again quietly. "Rest here if you need. The sun is strong, but the shade nearby will offer relief." She allowed herself a faint smile, a quiet acknowledgement of his words, the corners of her mouth lifting briefly as she accepted both the space and the presence of someone who had chosen to offer protection without demand or question. The horse shifted under Ethan, a soft breath escaping its nostrils, and he reached out to smooth a stray mane, the movement deliberate and careful, ensuring the animal remained calm in the warm, open space. Dust motes swirled gently, sunlight bouncing off the rocks in fragmented patterns, and the plateau itself seemed to embrace the moment, holding a quiet stillness as Ethan and Isla paused together, forming a subtle rhythm of trust and careful observation. Isla leaned slightly against a low boulder, the satchel held securely, glancing toward the distant canyon walls, eyes alert to the changes in light and shadow, and Ethan felt the delicate weight of that glance, the unspoken understanding of patience and awareness passing between them. The wind shifted, lifting the faint scent of sage and dry stone, carrying it across the plateau in soft currents that brushed their skin and stirred the edges of their clothing, and in that quiet, suspended moment, the canyon, the plateau, the horse, and the two travelers existed together in a shared space of anticipation, care, and the subtle unfolding of a connection yet to be fully revealed. The plateau opened into a hidden grove, sunlight filtering through the scattered branches of twisted juniper and casting patterns of light and shadow across the warm, sun-baked stones. Ethan guided the horse carefully toward the small pool of water at the grove's center, the surface calm and reflecting the sky above in a perfect, undisturbed mirror. Isla stepped lightly behind him, her satchel balanced securely, eyes wide and alert, noting every detail, the curve of the rocks, the subtle ripple in the pool, the faint scent of sage and desert blooms carried on the gentle breeze. She paused briefly, adjusting the amulet at her collar, and a soft smile touched her lips, the first real relaxation she had shown since Ethan had found her, a signal that the grove offered more than mere shelter. It offered recognition of her presence and respect for her space. Ethan lowered the reins and reached into the saddlebag, producing a small folded cloth and setting it on a flat stone, motioning toward it without a word. Isla approached cautiously, kneeling to inspect the arrangement, and Ethan stepped back, allowing the space between them to hold the weight of understanding and unspoken trust. The horse shifted its weight, ears flicking at the faint rustle of leaves, yet remained calm, standing quietly as if sensing the stillness of the moment. The sunlight caught on the amulet, sending tiny points of brightness across the surface of the pool, and for a heartbeat the grove seemed to glow, as though the canyon itself acknowledged a revelation waiting to unfold. Isla reached down, dipping her fingers into the water, letting the cool surface ripple outward, watching the light break and scatter, reflecting in her dark eyes with a shimmer of clarity and quiet strength. Ethan remained a few steps behind, careful not to crowd her, voice low, even and deliberate. "This place is for you, a place where the light is yours to meet and the wind carries nothing but what you allow." She nodded slowly, tracing the edge of the amulet with a fingertip, the weight of it both literal and symbolic, a tether to history and identity that spoke of a lineage unspoken until now. The wind shifted, brushing past them with a soft murmur, lifting dust and carrying the faint aroma of distant pine and warm stone, and in that subtle motion, Ethan caught a change in Isla's posture, a quiet rise of confidence, the way her shoulders straightened and her gaze lifted beyond the grove, toward the canyon that framed the world she had never fully been allowed to claim. A distant bird called sharply, echoing against the canyon walls, and Isla rose fully, the amulet glinting as she turned to face Ethan with a steadiness that was new yet entirely her own. The grove, the sun, the horse, and the two figures together held a shared breath, a moment poised on the edge of revelation. Isla spoke finally, voice soft but clear, words deliberate. "You see me now, not as they did, but as I am." And Ethan met her eyes, understanding not in words but in the weight of presence, the quiet acknowledgement that all the care, patience, and steadfast attention of the journey had led to this precise moment. Dust swirled lazily, sunlight scattered across stone, the breeze whispered through the branches, and in the stillness between them, the canyon seemed to bear witness to a truth waiting to be embraced, a recognition of identity and strength, the subtle shift of a story ready to unfold fully in the days to come, the beginning of trust transformed into understanding, and understanding into the quiet power of revelation. The sun began its slow descent toward the canyon rim, painting the rocks in deep amber and soft violet shadows, and Ethan led the horse to a patch of level ground near the edge of the grove, where the air was cool with the faint hint of evening breeze carrying the scent of pine and sun-warmed stone. Isla stepped beside him, satchel in hand, pausing to watch the water ripple in the small pool, the light reflecting in her dark eyes as she traced the shifting patterns on the surface. Ethan adjusted the reins, giving the horse a gentle pat on the neck, and then stepped back slightly, allowing space for the quiet pause between them, the soft hum of the canyon filling the silence. The amulet at Isla's collar caught the fading light, glinting with subtle brilliance, a symbol of lineage and presence that seemed to speak louder than words ever could. She tilted her head slightly, meeting Ethan's gaze, and for a moment the plateau, the grove, and the canyon beyond existed as a single, still tableau, holding the weight of their journey and the unspoken understanding that had been growing with each step. Ethan spoke softly, voice steady and even. The canyon holds many paths, but this one leads to where the wind carries nothing but the clarity of day and the quiet of evening. Isla nodded, a small, deliberate movement, acknowledging the promise of his words, her fingers brushing over the amulet as if feeling its history and her place within it. Dust swirled lazily around their boots, catching the light and flickering patterns, and the horse shifted slightly, ears flicking toward the distant calls of birds returning to their nests, yet remaining calm beneath Ethan's careful guidance. The sun dipped lower, and the shadows stretched across the stones, the warm glow highlighting the textures of rock and sand, and the stillness carried a sense of anticipation, the delicate balance of trust and understanding now tangible between them. Ethan lowered his gaze to the small pool, watching the water shimmer with reflective light, the subtle ripples moving in gentle, circular waves, and Isla reached down, fingers trailing lightly over the surface, sending tiny ripples outward, the light dancing along them in quiet celebration of the moment. The canyon seemed to hold its breath, every sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant murmur of the town below, the horses' quiet shifting, emphasized by the vast stillness around them. Isla rose slowly, satchel resting at her side, and for the first time, her posture carried the quiet authority of someone who had endured, observed, and chosen the path before her, the canyon, the grove, and the fading light acknowledging her presence, and the unspoken respect between her and Ethan. He stepped closer, careful and deliberate, his gaze steady, noting the subtle changes in her expression, the gentle tilt of her chin, the depth in her eyes reflecting courage and experience. The sun kissed the canyon rim, and the shadows lengthened, folding the plateau and grove into soft relief, and in that quiet, suspended moment, Ethan and Isla shared an understanding born of patience, care, and recognition of each other's presence, a silent promise that the journey ahead, though unknown, would be met with trust, respect, and the quiet power of steadfast companionship, the canyon, the horse, and the evening holding witness to the culmination of a journey that had begun with a simple act of care and had grown into a profound acknowledgement of identity and presence, the light fading gently as the air cooled and the world prepared to enter the calm of night.